Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity slows its pace, settles into something comfortable, and science takes the long, quiet way home. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight we're going to spend some gentle time with a question that most of us carry with us every day, even if we rarely stop to think about it. It's a question written plainly on our hands, our faces, our arms, resting quietly wherever you are listening right now. Why does human skin look so different across the world? It's one of those questions that feels obvious at first glance. You don't need a microscope or a textbook to notice that people from different parts of the world often have different skin tones, lighter shades, deeper shades, and every possible tone in between spread across continents and cultures. We see it so often that it becomes background information, like the colour of the sky or the sound of traffic in the distance, familiar enough that it rarely asks anything of us. And yet, when you pause and really look at it, when you let the question sit for a moment instead of rushing past it, it turns out to be quietly remarkable. Because underneath all that visible variation is a shared biological story, one that stretches back tens of thousands of years, shaped by sunlight, movement, survival, and time moving slowly, almost imperceptibly forward. So before we drift any further, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you wrapped in a blanket somewhere cool, or letting warm evening air move through an open window? And what time is it for you right now, in your small corner of this planet turning steadily beneath the sun? It's always a little fitting to think about place when talking about the human body, because place has had so much to say about how that body came to be. If you find this kind of slow, thoughtful exploration soothing, or if it helps you unwind after a long day, you're very welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this calm little space reach others who might need a gentle pause too. And now, with nothing demanding your attention, we can ease into the story itself. Human skin is often talked about as if it were a label, something fixed and defining. But biologically speaking, skin is first and foremost a working organ. It protects us, regulates our temperature, helps us sense the world, and quietly carries out chemical processes that keep us alive. Its colour, which draws so much attention, is just one part of a much larger system doing its job day after day, generation after generation. To understand why skin looks different across the world, it helps to step back from modern borders and identities and imagine a much older version of humanity. Not cities, not nations, not even agriculture yet. Just small groups of people moving across landscapes, responding to heat, cold, hunger, and light. In that deep past, skin colour wasn't about appearance or meaning. It was about balance. The key player in this story is something you've likely heard of before, though perhaps not thought much about. Melanin. It's a pigment produced by specialised cells in the skin, and its main job is deceptively simple. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation from the sun. That's it. No symbolism, no intention, no design. Just chemistry doing what chemistry does best. The more melanin your skin produces, the darker your skin appears. The less melanin, the lighter it appears. But what matters isn't the colour itself. What matters is what that melanin is doing. Ultraviolet radiation can damage DNA, break down essential nutrients, and increase the risk of skin cancers. Melanin acts as a natural filter, reducing how much of that radiation penetrates deeper into the body. Now imagine living near the equator tens of thousands of years ago. The sun is high in the sky for much of the year. Day after day, generation after generation, intense sunlight pours down with very little seasonal relief. In that environment, having more melanin is protective. It shields the skin and preserves vital compounds like folate, which is essential for reproduction and healthy development. Individuals whose bodies happened, through small genetic variations, to produce more melanin were slightly better protected. They were more likely to stay healthy, more likely to have children who survived, and more likely to pass on those traits. Not because nature was aiming for darker skin, but because those bodies functioned better under those conditions. Now slowly shift the scene. Groups of humans begin moving away from the equator, northward and southward, into regions where sunlight is weaker, less direct, and more seasonal. The days grow shorter in winter. The sun sits lower in the sky. Ultraviolet radiation becomes harder to come by. Here, the balance changes. Ultraviolet light isn't just something to be defended against, it's also necessary. Human skin uses UV radiation to produce vitamin D, a compound essential for bone health, immune function, and overall survival. When UV levels are low, too much melanin can actually become a disadvantage because it blocks the light needed to make enough vitamin D. In these regions, individuals with slightly less melanin had an edge. Their skin allowed more ultraviolet light to penetrate, helping their bodies produce sufficient vitamin D even under dimmer skies. Over many generations, this shift in balance favoured lighter skin tones. Again, not suddenly, and not everywhere in the same way, but gradually, subtly, almost invisibly. What's important to notice here is that skin colour didn't change because people became something different. It changed because human populations responded to local conditions, just as they always have. The same species adjusting its biology to different environments, guided by the quiet arithmetic of survival. This is why skin colour follows geography more closely than ancestry alone. If you were to draw a map of average skin tone across the world, you wouldn't see sharp lines that match modern borders. You'd see gradients. Darker tones clustered around the equator, lighter tones appearing as you move toward higher latitudes, and countless variations in between, shaped by migration, climate, and time. It's also why skin colour is such a poor marker for anything else. It tells you almost nothing about intelligence, behaviour, culture, or worth. It tells you about sunlight. That's it. A biological response to how much UV radiation a population encountered over long periods. And even that response isn't uniform. Human history is full of movement. People migrated, mixed, adapted, and moved again. Coastal populations experienced different conditions than inland ones. Mountain regions filtered sunlight differently. Diets mattered too, especially when foods rich in vitamin D were available, easing the pressure for lighter skin in some northern populations. This means there is no single path, no simple rule that explains every shade. Evolution is not a straight line, it's a patchwork. Traits emerge, spread, pause, overlap, and sometimes reverse direction depending on circumstance. Skin colour is one of the clearest examples of this messy, practical process at work. It's also worth remembering how slow all of this is. Changes in skin pigmentation unfolded over thousands of years, not lifetimes, not even dozens of generations. These were gradual shifts, accumulating quietly while people lived their lives, raised children, and adapted without ever knowing they were part of a long biological story. Seen this way, the variety of human skin tones becomes less mysterious and more grounded. It isn't evidence of separation, it's evidence of connection, a shared origin responding in different ways to different places. If you were to sit quietly in a busy place for a while, maybe on a bench near a train station, in a cafe, or watching people move past a window, one thing would become clear very quickly. Human faces are endlessly varied. Shapes, expressions, lines, colours, and small details shift from person to person in ways that are immediately noticeable and strangely familiar at the same time. And yet, beneath that variation, there is a strong sense of sameness. No matter where someone is from, you recognise them as human without effort. The eyes sit in the same general place. The mouth moves in recognisable ways. The skin stretches, folds, warms, cools, and reacts to the world in ways your own does too. That shared surface, the skin itself, is one of the most visible reminders that humanity is both diverse and unified. It is the boundary between the body and the environment, the place where the outside world meets living tissue. It feels temperature, pressure, pain, and comfort. It heals itself when damaged. It grows calluses when stressed and softens when cared for. And across the planet, it does all of this while wearing many different shades. It's easy to think of skin colour as something separate from the rest of biology, as if it were an add-on rather than a core feature. In everyday conversation, it's often treated like a defining characteristic, something that categorises people before anything else has a chance to speak. But biologically, skin is a single organ system with shared structures and functions across all humans. The differences we see are variations on the same design, not different designs altogether. Every human skin type contains the same basic layers. The outermost layer, the epidermis, serves as a protective shield. Beneath it lies the dermis, rich with blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissue. Deeper still is the hypodermis, cushioning the body and storing energy. Hair follicles, sweat glands, oil glands, and immune cells are present in all of us. The blueprint does not change from continent to continent. What does change is how much melanin is produced and how it is distributed within the skin. This difference, while visually striking, is chemically modest. The number of melanocytes, the cells that produce melanin, is roughly the same in people of all skin tones. What varies is their activity. In darker skin, melanocytes produce more melanin and package it into larger, more persistent structures. In lighter skin, melanin production is lower, and the pigment is broken down more quickly. This distinction matters because it reframes skin colour as a matter of degree rather than kind. There is no point at which one type of skin becomes fundamentally different from another. Instead, there is a continuous spectrum shaped by countless small genetic variations layered over time. When you look at a world map coloured by average skin tone, the result is not a set of neat categories, it's a gradient. A slow, uneven blending from darker to lighter tones as you move away from the equator. Coastal regions, high-altitude areas, and places with unique diets complicate the pattern further. Islands tell slightly different stories than continents. Mountain ranges bend the rules. History leaves fingerprints everywhere. This is why any attempt to divide humanity into rigid groups based on skin colour quickly falls apart under closer inspection. Two people with similar skin tones may be genetically less similar than two people with different tones. Most genetic variation exists within populations, not between them. Skin colour accounts for a tiny fraction of human genetic diversity, even though it's one of the first things we notice. The reason we notice it so readily has less to do with biology and more to do with psychology. Human brains are extremely good at detecting visual differences, especially on faces. Evolution favoured this skill because recognising individuals, expressions, and social cues was essential for survival. Skin tone, being highly visible, became one of many features the brain processes automatically. Over time, societies layered meanings onto those visible differences. Cultural narratives, social hierarchies, and historical events amplified skin colour far beyond its biological significance. But that amplification happened long after skin colour itself evolved. The biology came first, quietly shaped by the sun and geography. The stories came later. It's worth sitting with that order for a moment. Skin colour was never meant to carry moral weight, social rank, or identity. It emerged as a practical response to environmental conditions. Only after humans began organising themselves into complex societies did skin tone become entangled with power, access, and assumption. If we return to the body itself, skin does not behave differently because of its colour in most everyday functions. Darker skin and lighter skin sweat in the same way. They regulate temperature using the same mechanisms. They feel touch, pressure, and pain through the same types of nerve endings. They heal using the same cellular processes. Differences exist in susceptibility to certain conditions like sunburn or vitamin D deficiency, but these are differences of exposure and balance, not capability. Even the idea that darker skin is somehow thicker or tougher is a myth. Thickness varies more by body location and individual genetics than by skin tone. The sensation that darker skin might be more resilient often comes from its increased melanin, which reduces visible damage from ultraviolet light, not from a fundamentally different structure. Another quiet reminder of shared biology is how skin responds to injury or inflammation. Across all skin tones, blood flow increases during healing. What differs is how that redness appears on the surface. In lighter skin, inflammation often shows as pink or red. In darker skin, it may appear as deepened brown, purple, or grey tones. The process underneath is the same, only the visible signal changes. This difference in visibility has had real consequences in medicine, where diagnostic tools and training historically centred on lighter skin. Conditions that present clearly as redness in lighter tones may be harder to recognise without experience in darker tones. This isn't because darker skin behaves differently, but because observation has not always kept pace with diversity. It's another example of how perception can lag behind biology. When you widen the lens to include human history, the idea of a shared surface becomes even more striking. Modern humans emerged in Africa, where darker skin provided essential protection under intense sunlight. As small groups migrated outward, they carried that original skin biology with them. Changes accumulated slowly, influenced by local conditions, diet, and chance. At no point did humanity split into separate branches based on skin colour. There was always overlap, always movement, always mixing. The same species adapting again and again, never stopping long enough to become something else. This is why attempts to assign sharp boundaries to skin colour feel artificial when examined closely. Nature prefers gradients. It works through probabilities, not labels. The world of faces we see today is the result of that long, patient process, still ongoing. Even now, skin colour continues to change, though not in dramatic ways from one generation to the next. Global migration, intermarriage, and shifting lifestyles are blending traits in new combinations. Modern technology alters how much sunlight we encounter. Diets change nutrient availability. Medical care reduces some pressures that once influenced survival. Evolution doesn't stop, but it does respond to new circumstances. In this context, skin colour becomes less of a marker of difference and more of a record. It tells a story about where ancestors lived, how they moved, and what challenges they faced. It's a biological map written slowly and revised constantly. There's also something quietly grounding in recognising that skin, for all its visibility, is only a surface. Beneath it, organs function in the same way. Blood carries oxygen using the same molecules. Bones grow and remodel through the same signals. Neurons fire using the same electrical language. The differences that matter most to survival and experience are largely invisible. And yet, because skin is what we see first, it becomes a kind of meeting place between biology and perception. It shapes first impressions. It influences how people are treated. It becomes a canvas for both misunderstanding and connection. Understanding that this surface is shared, that it follows the same rules everywhere, can gently shift how we think about human variation. Differences remain real and meaningful, but they no longer imply separation at the deepest level. Instead, they reflect adaptation, history, and the simple fact that life responds to its surroundings. A planet full of faces, each distinct, all built from the same materials. At some point, usually without realizing it, most people ask the same quiet question. It doesn't arrive loudly or formally. It slips in during a moment of observation, perhaps while travelling, perhaps while looking at old photographs, or perhaps while noticing how different hands look side by side on a table. The question is simple, almost obvious once it appears. Why does skin look like this here and different somewhere else? It's a question written directly on the body, visible without explanation, and because it's visible, it often feels like it should have a simple answer. Sun equals dark, less sun equals light. End of story. But that answer, while pointing in the right direction, skips over the long chain of causes that connect environment to biology, and biology to the everyday reality of human bodies. Skin does not ask questions itself. It doesn't know where it is or why it looks the way it does. It responds, slowly, quietly, and without intention. The question is ours, asked after the fact, once the changes are already there. When early humans first appeared, skin was already doing its job. It protected against dehydration. It helped regulate body temperature. It provided a barrier against microbes. Colour existed then too, but not in the range we see today. The earliest members of our species lived in environments where sunlight was intense and consistent. In those conditions, darker skin was not an identity. It was a consequence. The moment humans began moving into different environments, the conditions that shaped skin began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently. Sunlight weakened or intensified. Seasons lengthened or shortened. Diets shifted. Clothing appeared. Shelter became more common. Each of these changes altered how much ultraviolet radiation reached the skin. Ultraviolet radiation sits at the centre of this story because it is both necessary and dangerous. Too much of it damages DNA, degrades folate, and increases the risk of skin cancers. Too little of it reduces the body's ability to produce vitamin D, which plays a crucial role in bone development, immune health, and muscle function. Skin colour exists in the narrow space between these two risks. This balance is not theoretical. It is enforced by survival. Populations that drifted too far toward one extreme paid a cost. Those costs shaped who thrived, who struggled, and who passed on their traits. The question written on the skin is therefore not just, why do people look different, but how did different places apply different pressures? Skin is one of the few organs where those pressures remain clearly visible. If you imagine standing near the equator thousands of years ago, the sun overhead day after day, there is no mystery about why protection mattered. Skin exposed constantly to intense UV radiation faced a relentless challenge. Melanin absorbed that radiation, reduced cellular damage, and protected essential nutrients. Individuals whose skin produced more melanin had a better chance of maintaining reproductive health and avoiding lethal damage. In this context, darker skin was not a feature to be noticed. It was a background condition, as unremarkable as strong leg muscles for walking long distances or sweat glands adapted for heat. It didn't invite explanation, because it fit the environment seamlessly. The question only begins to form once humans leave those conditions. As groups moved north and south, sunlight changed in predictable ways. At higher latitudes, UV radiation arrives at a lower angle, spreads over more atmosphere, and weakens before reaching the ground. Winter reduces exposure even further. In some places, months pass with minimal UV availability. In those environments, the protective role of melanin begins to conflict with another requirement. Vitamin D production drops. Bones weaken. Immune systems suffer. Fertility declines. These effects are subtle at first, but over generations subtle pressures accumulate. Skin that allowed more ultraviolet light through, skin with less melanin helped restore balance. It was not perfect, and it came with its own risks, but under low UV conditions the trade-off favoured lighter pigmentation. This shift did not happen because humans needed lighter skin in a conscious sense. It happened because small genetic variations that reduced melanin production became slightly more advantageous in certain environments. Over time, those variations became more common. What makes this question interesting is that the answer is never singular. There is no single reason, no single pathway, no single outcome. The same latitude does not always produce the same skin tone. Diet can offset UV scarcity. Fish-rich diets provide vitamin D, reducing pressure for lighter skin. Clothing reduces sun exposure, altering selective forces. Altitude increases UV intensity even far from the equator. Clouds, vegetation, and cultural practices all play a role. This is why skin colour patterns are similar across the world but never identical. Northern Europe and East Asia share similar latitudes, but their populations developed different average skin tones and distributions. Africa itself contains enormous variation, shaped by altitude, migration, and ecological diversity. The Americas present another set of patterns, influenced by relatively recent migration and adaptation. The question written on the skin therefore resists clean answers. It demands context. It demands history. It demands patience. Another reason the question lingers is that skin colour feels personal. It is not like blood type or enzyme variation, which remain hidden. Skin is visible to others and to ourselves. It becomes part of identity whether we want it to or not. That visibility invites interpretation, comparison, and too often, judgment. Biology does not participate in those interpretations. Skin does not know it is being watched. It does not carry meaning. It performs chemistry. Melanin does not express culture. It absorbs photons. The disconnect between what skin does and what skin is made to represent creates confusion. People look for intention where there was only adaptation. They look for hierarchy where there was only balance. They look for boundaries where nature drew gradients. This is why the question is simple, but the answer takes time. Another layer complicates it further. Skin colour is not fixed even within individuals. It responds to sunlight over a lifetime. It darkens with exposure. It lightens with absence. It changes with age, health, and hormonal shifts. Scars form differently. Pigmentation redistributes. The skin you have at one stage of life is not exactly the skin you had before. This plasticity is often overlooked. It reminds us that skin is dynamic, not static. Even the traits shaped over thousands of years remain responsive to daily conditions. When people ask why skin is different across the world, they're often really asking something else. They're asking whether difference implies distance, whether variation implies separation, whether visible traits reflect deeper divisions. Biology answers quietly. No. The genetic differences that influence skin colour represent a very small fraction of the differences between individuals. Two people with very different skin tones may share more genetic material than two people with similar tones. Skin colour is influenced by a limited set of genes with outsized visual impact. This mismatch between visual prominence and biological significance makes skin colour misleading. It looks important because it is easy to see. It is treated as important because it has been made socially important. But biologically it sits alongside countless other traits shaped by environment and chance. Hair texture follows similar patterns. Eye shape responds to climate. Body proportions vary with temperature. None of these traits define separate categories of human. They define local adjustments. The simple question written on the skin therefore points to a larger lesson. Human variation is shallow and recent. The deepest branches of our evolutionary tree lie far behind us. What we see on the surface reflects adaptation, not division. Understanding this does not erase the lived realities associated with skin colour. Social meaning is real because people act on it. History has consequences. But understanding the biological origin of variation strips away the illusion that difference was designed to separate. It wasn't. Skin tells a story of movement, of ancestors walking into new light, of bodies negotiating survival without awareness of the long-term outcome, of small changes accumulating quietly while life went on. That story does not end in the past. It continues now. Migration mixes traits. Modern lifestyles alter sun exposure. Nutrition changes selective pressures. Medical care reduces some risks while introducing others. Skin, like the rest of the body, continues to respond. The question remains visible because the answer is ongoing. When people think about sunlight, they often imagine it as something simple and immediate. Warmth on the skin, brightness through a window, a signal that it's daytime and time to be awake. But over the long arc of human history, sunlight has been far more than a daily experience. It has been a shaping force, quiet and persistent, working over thousands of years, leaving traces not only on landscapes but on bodies themselves. Latitude is the key that determines how sunlight behaves in a place. It decides the angle at which the sun's rays arrive, how much atmosphere they must pass through, how intense they are, and how they change with the seasons. Near the equator, sunlight strikes the Earth more directly. The energy is concentrated. Ultraviolet radiation is strong and relatively consistent throughout the year. As you move north or south, the angle flattens. The same sunlight spreads out over a larger area, weakens, and becomes more variable. Winters lengthen, summers compress, shadows stretch. This is not a subtle difference when measured across generations. A body living for thousands of years under one pattern of light experiences a very different set of pressures than a body living under another. Skin, because it is exposed directly to sunlight, becomes one of the first places those pressures leave a mark. The idea that latitude influences biology can feel abstract when described in numbers or diagrams. But for early humans, latitude translated into lived experience. It meant how harsh the sun felt at midday. It meant how quickly skin burned or healed. It meant whether children developed strong bones or suffered from deformities. It meant whether pregnancy progressed normally or ended too soon. These outcomes were not dramatic in the moment, they were cumulative. Sunlight interacts with the body in multiple ways, but two pathways mattered most for skin evolution. One involved damage, the other involved synthesis. Ultraviolet radiation can break chemical bonds, it can damage DNA, it can degrade folate, a B vitamin essential for cell division and fetal development. Excessive UV exposure increases the risk of skin cancers, particularly later in life. These effects push in one direction, favouring protection. At the same time, ultraviolet radiation is necessary for the production of vitamin D. When UVB rays strike the skin, they trigger a chemical reaction that ultimately allows the body to synthesize this compound. Vitamin D is not optional. It supports calcium absorption, bone growth, muscle function, immune response, and overall metabolic health. Deficiency can lead to rickets in children, weakened bones in adults, increased infection risk and complications during pregnancy. These effects push in the opposite direction, favouring exposure. Latitude determines how easily a population can satisfy both needs at once. Near the equator, ultraviolet radiation is abundant. Even with high melanin levels, enough UV reaches the deeper layers of the skin to support vitamin D production. The risk of damage, however, remains constant. In this setting, darker skin offers protection without preventing essential synthesis. The balance holds. At higher latitudes, the equation changes. Ultraviolet radiation becomes scarce, especially during winter months. High melanin levels now block a significant portion of the already limited UVB rays. Vitamin D production drops. The protective benefit remains, but the cost grows heavier. Over generations, this imbalance becomes a selective pressure. This does not mean that latitude mechanically produces skin colour. It sets conditions. Within those conditions, variation is filtered. Individuals with slightly different pigmentation experience slightly different outcomes. Those outcomes influence survival and reproduction in small but consistent ways. One of the reasons this process feels unintuitive is that it unfolds slowly. No individual wakes up with lighter skin because winter arrived. No single generation transforms. Instead, tiny genetic differences accumulate. A gene variant that reduces melanin production slightly becomes more common. Another that alters melanin distribution gains ground. Over thousands of years, the population average shifts. The memory of place is written into skin because skin records long-term exposure, not short-term events. This is why people whose ancestors lived for many generations at similar latitudes often share similar skin tones, even if they are culturally unrelated. It is also why populations that moved recently retain traits shaped elsewhere. The body remembers where it has been, even when the individual does not. Migration complicates this picture in important ways. Human movement has never been orderly or uniform. Groups split, merged, paused, and rerouted. Some settled in coastal regions where reflective water increased UV exposure. Others lived at high altitudes where thinner air intensified radiation. Some relied heavily on animal foods rich in vitamin D. Others depended more on plant-based diets. Each of these factors altered the relationship between latitude and skin. Consider populations living far north with access to vitamin D-rich diets, such as fatty fish and marine mammals. In these cases, dietary intake reduced the pressure for lighter skin, even under low UV conditions. As a result, some northern populations retained darker pigmentation than latitude alone would predict. Altitude adds another layer. UV radiation increases with elevation because there is less atmosphere to absorb it. Populations living in mountainous regions often experience stronger UV exposure than nearby lowland groups at the same latitude. Skin adaptation in these regions reflects that difference. Seasonality also matters. Some regions receive intense sunlight during short summers and very little during long winters. Others experience more moderate, evenly distributed exposure. The rhythm of light shapes how much UV the skin encounters across the year, influencing long-term balance. All of this means that latitude is not a strict ruler. It is a framework. Within that framework, local conditions, behaviour and culture modify outcomes. Clothing, for example, changed the rules. As humans developed better shelter and garments, the amount of skin exposed to sunlight decreased. This did not eliminate UV exposure, but it altered its distribution. Covered skin produces less vitamin D. This may have increased selective pressure for lighter pigmentation in some regions, particularly during colder periods when clothing was worn year-round. However, clothing itself did not appear everywhere at once, or serve the same function everywhere. In some environments, minimal clothing was sufficient. In others, protection from cold became essential. These cultural choices interacted with biology, shaping outcomes in complex ways. It is also important to recognize that the relationship between sunlight and skin is not purely about averages. Individuals vary widely. Some people burn easily, others tan readily. Some produce vitamin D efficiently, others do not. These differences exist within all populations. Evolution does not eliminate variation, it reshapes its distribution. This variability explains why skin tone within a population can span a wide range. It also explains why migration does not immediately produce mismatch. Bodies are flexible. They adjust behaviourally before biology catches up. People seek shade, they change clothing, they modify diet. These adjustments buffer the impact of new environments. Over long periods, though, the underlying pressures remain. Latitude continues to shape the baseline. Sunlight continues to interact with skin. The memory accumulates. What makes this memory feel distant is that modern life has disrupted many of the original patterns. Artificial lighting extends days. Indoor living reduces sun exposure. Sunscreen alters UV absorption. Supplementation replaces dietary deficiencies. Medical care mitigates consequences that once influenced survival. As a result, the selective pressures that shaped skin over most of human history have weakened. Evolution still operates, but its pace and direction have shifted. The skin you see today reflects past environments more than present ones. This can create confusion. People living at high latitudes today may have dark skin inherited from ancestors adapted to intense sunlight. Without dietary support or supplementation, they may face higher risks of vitamin D deficiency. Conversely, people with very light skin living near the equator may face increased risk of UV-related damage without protective behaviour. These mismatches highlight an important point. Skin colour is not destiny. It is context-dependent. It evolved under specific conditions that may no longer apply. Understanding this helps separate biology from assumption. It explains why skin tone does not always match location in the modern world. It also explains why health outcomes related to sunlight must be addressed thoughtfully, without relying on simplistic ideas about what skin is meant to do. Latitude does not care about identity. It does not assign meaning. It applies energy according to geometry and physics. Skin responds according to chemistry and genetics. Everything else is interpretation layered on top. The long memory of place stored in skin is therefore not a message about who people are. It is a record of where ancestors lived and how bodies negotiated light and dark over deep time. This perspective can change how difference feels. Instead of seeing variation as separation, it becomes evidence of shared adaptability. The same species, encountering different skies, adjusting quietly and continuously. Beneath the surface of the skin, far below what the eye can see, there is a process unfolding quietly and constantly, one that has shaped human appearance more than any other single biological factor. It does not announce itself. It does not act with intention. It does not change quickly. And yet, over long stretches of time, it has left a visible record across the entire planet. That process centers on melanin. Melanin is often spoken of as if it were a color, but that description barely scratches the surface of what it actually is. Melanin is a group of pigments produced through a complex biochemical pathway, one that exists not to decorate the body, but to protect it. Its primary role is functional. It absorbs ultraviolet radiation, disperses energy as heat, and reduces damage to DNA and other vital molecules. Everything else that follows, including visible skin tone, is a byproduct. Every human being produces melanin. There is no such thing as skin without it. The differences we see across populations are not about presence or absence, but about quantity, type, and distribution. These differences arise from small variations in genes that regulate how melanin is made, packaged, transported, and broken down. The cells responsible for producing melanin are called melanocytes. They sit in the basal layer of the epidermis, the deepest part of the outer skin. Their number is remarkably consistent across humans. People with darker skin do not have significantly more melanocytes than people with lighter skin. What differs is how active those melanocytes are, and how their product is handled once it is made. Inside melanocytes, melanin is synthesized in specialized structures called melanosomes. These melanosomes vary in size, shape, and persistence. In darker skin, melanosomes tend to be larger, more numerous, and more resistant to breakdown. They're distributed more evenly throughout the skin cells. In lighter skin, melanosomes are smaller, fewer, and degraded more quickly. They cluster closer to the surface and do not persist as long. This distinction has practical consequences. Larger, more persistent melanosomes absorb more ultraviolet radiation and protect deeper tissues more effectively. Smaller, short-lived melanosomes allow more UV to penetrate. The process that produces melanin begins with an amino acid called tyrosine. Through a series of enzymatic reactions, tyrosine is converted into different forms of melanin. The two primary types are eumelanin and pheomelanin. Eumelanin appears brown to black and provides strong UV protection. Pheomelanin appears red to yellow and offers much less protection, sometimes even increasing UV sensitivity. Most human skin contains a mixture of both, but the balance differs. Darker skin contains higher levels of eumelanin, lighter skin contains lower total melanin and a higher proportion of pheomelanin. This balance influences not only skin tone, but also how skin responds to sunlight. Melanin does not work like sunscreen. It does not block UV radiation completely. It filters it. It reduces intensity. It slows damage. This moderation is key. Complete blocking would interfere with vitamin D production. Complete absence would allow excessive damage. Evolution favoured systems that tune this balance to local conditions. What makes melanin a quiet architect is not just its function, but its timescale. Changes in melanin-related traits occur slowly. They require generations. They emerge from the accumulation of small genetic shifts rather than sudden transformations. These genetic shifts affect proteins involved in melanin synthesis and transport. Some influence enzyme efficiency. Others affect how melanosomes move within cells. Still others alter how signals from ultraviolet exposure regulate melanin production. No single gene controls skin color. It is a polygenic trait, shaped by the interaction of many genes. This complexity explains why skin tone varies continuously, rather than falling into discrete categories. It also explains why two people with similar skin tones may have different genetic pathways producing that result. It is tempting to imagine melanin as a static trait, something set at birth and unchanging. In reality, melanin production is responsive. Skin darkens with sun exposure because melanocytes increase activity. This tanning response is a short-term adjustment, not an evolutionary change, but it reflects the same underlying system. The ability to tan varies widely. Some people produce more melanin in response to UV exposure. Others produce very little. This variation has genetic roots and reflects different evolutionary histories. In regions where sunlight was intense year-round, there was less need for a rapid tanning response because baseline melanin levels were already high. In regions with variable sunlight, the ability to adjust seasonally became more useful. This responsiveness adds another layer to how melanin shapes human experience. It means skin tone is not just inherited, but lived. It changes with environment, behavior, and age. Melanin also plays roles beyond UV protection. It influences how skin absorbs heat. It affects how visible blood vessels and inflammation appear. It interacts with immune responses in subtle ways. These effects are secondary, but they contribute to how skin functions as an interface with the world. Despite its importance, melanin does not operate in isolation. Its effects depend on the context of the entire organism. Diet, for example, influences how well the body can manage UV exposure and repair damage. Folate levels, antioxidant availability, and overall nutritional status interact with melanin's protective role. Melanin also interacts with culture. Clothing, shelter, and behavior can reduce or increase UV exposure, altering how much work melanin needs to do. These cultural adaptations can buffer biological mismatches, allowing people to thrive in environments different from those their ancestors evolved in. This buffering is part of why human skin variation did not continue to sharpen indefinitely. Cultural innovation slowed biological divergence. Once clothing and shelter became widespread, the selective pressure on skin pigmentation weakened. Variation stabilized. Understanding melanin as an architect rather than designer helps clarify its role. It does not aim, it responds. It builds gradually in response to energy exposure. It leaves behind visible patterns that we interpret after the fact. This interpretation often goes wrong when melanin is treated as a marker of difference, rather than a record of adaptation. Because it is visible, it invites classification. Because it varies, it invites comparison. But melanin does not encode identity, it encodes response. It is also important to recognize what melanin does not do. It does not determine intelligence. It does not determine behavior. It does not determine character. These ideas have no biological basis. They arise from social narratives imposed on a trait that happen to be easy to see. From a biological perspective, melanin is unremarkable. Many organisms produce it. It exists in fungi, plants, and animals. It performs similar functions across species. In humans, it became a focal point only because of how it interacts with sunlight and how visible its effects are on skin. The quiet nature of melanin's influence is easy to miss because its outcome is so apparent. But the process itself is slow, decentralized, and indifferent. No single generation decides. No population plans. The changes emerge from countless small interactions between bodies and environments. This becomes especially clear when considering populations that do not fit simple models. Groups living at similar latitudes can have different skin tones. Populations with similar skin tones can live in very different environments. These patterns reflect the complexity of migration, diet, altitude and culture layered on top of latitude. Melanin's role is therefore not to produce uniformity, but to mediate between light and life under specific conditions. It is a system tuned by exposure, shaped by constraint, and maintained by balance. Even within individuals, melanin does not behave uniformly. Different parts of the body receive different amounts of sun. Hands, faces, and arms often darken more than covered areas. Scar tissue may heal with altered pigmentation. Hormonal changes can influence melanin distribution. Aging affects melanocyte function. These variations remind us that skin is dynamic. The architect is always working, adjusting, responding. In the modern world, many of the original pressures that shaped melanin distribution have changed. Sunscreen blocks UV radiation. Supplements provide vitamin D. Indoor living reduces exposure. Artificial lighting extends days. These changes do not erase the biological system, but they alter how it operates. As a result, mismatches can arise. People with high melanin levels living at high latitudes may require dietary support to maintain vitamin D levels. People with low melanin living near the equator may require behavioral protection to avoid damage. These are not failures of biology. They are consequences of rapid environmental change. Recognizing melanin as a quiet architect helps frame these issues without judgment. Skin color is not right or wrong for a place. It reflects past conditions more than present ones. The body carries history forward even when the landscape shifts. Stand anywhere near the equator for long enough, and the sun makes its presence unmistakably clear. It does not skim the horizon or arrive timidly through clouds for a few hours before retreating. It rises high, travels nearly overhead, and delivers its energy directly, day after day, season after season. This constancy is what makes equatorial regions unique, not just climatically, but biologically. Over deep time, that steady intensity has acted like a persistent hand, shaping living systems in ways that remain visible today, especially on human skin. To understand why deeper skin tones are most common near the equator, it helps to strip away modern assumptions and return to the conditions under which those traits emerged. Early humans did not experience sunlight as something optional or recreational. There were no indoor jobs, no sunscreen, no reliable shade structures. Life unfolded outdoors. Hunting, gathering, travelling, socialising and resting all happened under open skies. The sun was not a background feature. It was an environmental constant. Near the equator, ultraviolet radiation is intense and relatively stable throughout the year. Unlike higher latitudes where the sun's angle shifts dramatically with the seasons, equatorial regions receive strong UV exposure almost every day. The atmosphere absorbs less of the radiation because the sun's rays strike more directly. There is less scattering, less dilution. The energy arrives concentrated. This matters because ultraviolet radiation interacts with the body at the molecular level. When UV photons penetrate skin, they can damage DNA, disrupt cellular processes, and degrade important nutrients. One of the most vulnerable of these nutrients is folate, a B vitamin essential for DNA synthesis, cell division, and fetal development. Folate deficiency increases the risk of birth defects and reduces reproductive success. In environments with intense UV exposure, protecting folate becomes a matter of survival across generations. Melanin absorbs ultraviolet radiation before it can penetrate deeply enough to cause this damage. The more melanin present, the more effective the filtering. In equatorial environments, individuals whose skin produced higher levels of melanin experienced less UV-induced damage. Their folate levels were better preserved. Their cells accumulated fewer mutations. Over time, these advantages translated into higher survival and reproductive success. This process did not involve awareness or choice. No one selected darker skin because it looked a certain way. Selection operated through outcomes. Bodies that functioned better under intense sunlight were more likely to persist. It is important to emphasize how gradual this was. Evolution does not respond to discomfort or inconvenience. It responds to differences in survival and reproduction that persist over many generations. Sunburn alone was not the driver. The deeper consequences of UV exposure, including folate degradation and cumulative DNA damage, exerted pressure slowly and relentlessly. Equatorial environments also pose challenges beyond sunlight. Heat, humidity, and infectious disease shaped human physiology in many ways. Skin played a role here too. Sweating efficiently was critical for temperature regulation. Human skin evolved with a high density of sweat glands, allowing heat to dissipate through evaporation. Darker skin did not interfere with this process. In fact, by protecting against UV damage while allowing effective thermoregulation, deeper pigmentation complemented other adaptations. Another factor often overlooked is the timing of skin cancer. Most UV-induced skin cancers develop later in life, often after reproductive age. This means they exert less direct evolutionary pressure. Folate degradation, by contrast, affects fertility and fetal development much earlier. This difference helps explain why pigmentation evolved primarily as a response to nutrient protection rather than cancer prevention, even though both are related to UV exposure. Near the equator, where UV levels were highest, the balance between necessary exposure and dangerous excess tipped strongly toward protection. There was little risk of vitamin D deficiency because UV radiation was abundant. Even heavily pigmented skin allowed enough UV to penetrate for vitamin D synthesis. The cost of reducing exposure was minimal. The benefit of protection was substantial. This asymmetry is crucial. Darker skin near the equator carried few biological downsides in that environment. Lighter skin would have increased UV penetration, but that added exposure did not provide meaningful benefits because vitamin D production was already sufficient. Instead, it increased risk. Over time, populations converged toward deeper pigmentation because it solved a problem without creating a new one. Latitude alone does not tell the whole story, but near the equator it exerts its strongest influence. Even small changes in UV intensity can have large effects over long timescales. That is why skin pigmentation patterns correlate so closely with distance from the equator, especially in regions where humans lived for tens of thousands of years without major interruptions. Africa illustrates this clearly. As the continent where modern humans originated, it contains the deepest and longest history of human adaptation to intense sunlight. Many African populations live in equatorial or near equatorial regions, where UV radiation is high year-round. The prevalence of deep skin tones in these populations reflects that history. At the same time, Africa also demonstrates the limits of simple explanations. Not all African populations have the same skin tone. Highland regions, forested areas, and populations with different subsistence strategies show variation. Altitude increases UV exposure even at higher latitudes. Dense vegetation can reduce direct sunlight. Migration and mixing introduce new genetic combinations. Skin reflects these nuances. Outside Africa, similar patterns appear in equatorial regions of South America, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. Indigenous populations in these areas often exhibit deeper skin tones, shaped by similar pressures. These similarities emerged independently, not because of shared ancestry in recent times, but because similar environments favoured similar solutions. This phenomenon is called convergent evolution. When different populations face similar challenges, they may develop similar traits even if they are not closely related. Deep pigmentation near the equator is one such trait. It is not a marker of a single lineage. It is a response repeated wherever intense sunlight dominates. The idea that the equator paints with deeper shades can be misleading if taken too literally. The sun does not apply colour directly. It sets conditions under which certain biological responses become advantageous. Over time, those responses become more common. The visible result looks like painting, but the process is one of filtering and accumulation. Another important aspect is stability. Equatorial environments have been relatively stable in terms of sunlight over geological timescales. Ice ages altered global climates, but the equator remained a zone of high UV exposure. This stability allowed pigmentation patterns to persist and refine over long periods. In contrast, higher latitudes experienced dramatic fluctuations in sunlight and temperature, creating shifting pressures. Because of this stability, equatorial populations often retained deep pigmentation even as other traits changed. There was no sustained incentive to move toward a lighter skin. The protective advantage remained constant. Cultural factors also played a role, though secondary to biology. In many equatorial regions, clothing historically covered less skin, increasing exposure. This reinforced the protective value of melanin. Where shelter and clothing reduced exposure, the pressure weakened, but it rarely reversed completely because sunlight remained intense. Diet mattered less near the equator in terms of vitamin D. UV exposure was sufficient regardless of food sources. This meant that dietary variation did not significantly alter selective pressures on skin pigmentation, unlike in higher latitudes where diet could offset low UV availability. It is also worth noting that deeper skin pigmentation does not imply uniform darkness. Even within equatorial populations, there is a range of tones. Genetic variation persists. Evolution does not eliminate diversity. It narrows it around functional ranges. This range reflects the fact that skin pigmentation is controlled by many genes. Each contributes a small effect. The combination determines outcome. Different combinations can produce similar results. This redundancy allows populations to maintain diversity while meeting functional needs. Modern misconceptions often arise when deeper skin tones are interpreted through social lenses rather than biological ones. Historically, colonial narratives assigned value and meaning to pigmentation differences, ignoring their environmental origins. These narratives persist in subtle ways, distorting how people understand variation. Biology offers a corrective perspective. Deeper skin near the equator is not an exception or an anomaly. It is the expected outcome of prolonged exposure to intense UV radiation. It is evidence of successful adaptation, not deviation. In the present day, globalization has blurred the old patterns. People live far from the environments their ancestors adapted to. Someone with deep pigmentation may live at high latitude and experience vitamin D deficiency without supplementation. Someone with very light skin may live near the equator and require protection from UV damage. These situations reflect environmental change outpacing biological change. They also highlight how quickly culture can compensate. Clothing, diet, medical care, and technology allow humans to thrive across environments that would once have imposed strong selective pressures. This flexibility reduces the role of pigmentation in survival today, but it does not erase its history. The equator's influence remains visible because skin carries a long memory. It records where ancestors lived, not where individuals currently reside. That memory fades slowly, reshaped only over many generations. Understanding why deeper shades dominate near the equator helps ground the broader story of human variation. It shows how a single environmental factor, applied consistently over time, can shape a visible trait without dividing a species. As human groups moved farther away from the equator, the sky itself began to behave differently. The sun no longer climbed straight overhead. Its path shortened, its angle flattened. Light arrived slanted, filtered through more atmosphere, weaker by the time it touched the ground. Over the course of a year, entire months passed with little effective ultraviolet radiation reaching human skin. These northern skies were not just dimmer, they were inconsistent, shaped by long winters, short summers, and a rhythm of light and dark unlike anything near the equator. For bodies that had evolved under intense, reliable sunlight, this shift mattered. It did not announce itself dramatically. There was no sudden crisis, no clear boundary crossed. Instead, the balance that skin had quietly maintained for generations began to tilt. Protection was still present, but necessity started to change. The central challenge in these regions was not too much ultraviolet radiation, it was too little. Ultraviolet B radiation, the specific band of sunlight required for vitamin D synthesis, becomes increasingly scarce at higher latitudes. During winter months, especially above roughly 35 degrees north or south, UVB levels can drop so low that vitamin D production in the skin essentially stops. Even in summer, the window for effective exposure may be short. Vitamin D is not a minor nutrient. It plays a foundational role in calcium absorption, bone mineralization, immune regulation, muscle strength, and cellular signaling. In children, deficiency can lead to rickets, a condition characterized by weak, deformed bones. In adults, it increases the risk of fractures, chronic pain, immune dysfunction, and complications during pregnancy. In environments where UVB was scarce, skin that blocked too much sunlight became a liability. High melanin levels, which were protective near the equator, now reduced the already limited UV penetration further. The result was lower vitamin D synthesis and higher risk of deficiency-related problems. Over long periods of time, this imbalance created selective pressure in the opposite direction. Individuals whose skin allowed more ultraviolet light to penetrate, those with lower melanin production, were better able to maintain adequate vitamin D levels under weak sunlight. Their bones developed more reliably. Their immune systems functioned more effectively. Their reproductive outcomes improved slightly, but consistently. Those small advantages mattered. The process that led to lighter skin in northern regions was not driven by aesthetics or comfort. It was driven by chemistry, by how photons interacted with skin, by how efficiently a body could convert light into a molecule essential for survival. This shift did not require the complete removal of melanin. It required moderation, enough reduction to permit sufficient UV penetration without eliminating protection entirely. Lighter skin emerged gradually, shaped by genes that altered melanin production, melanosome size, distribution, and breakdown. It is important to recognize that lighter skin is not a single adaptation. It arose independently in different populations through different genetic pathways. European populations and East Asian populations, for example, both developed lighter skin tones, but many of the genes involved differ. This is another example of convergent evolution, where similar environmental pressures produce similar outcomes through different biological routes. Northern Europe provides one clear case. As populations settled in regions with long winters and limited sunlight, lighter pigmentation became increasingly common. This shift was reinforced by dietary changes. Early agricultural diets, particularly those low in animal products, reduced vitamin D intake from food, increasing reliance on sunlight. Under these conditions, lighter skin offered a clear advantage. In contrast, some northern populations that maintained diets rich in vitamin D, such as those relying heavily on fish and marine mammals, experienced less pressure to lighten skin. This is why certain Arctic and subarctic populations retained relatively darker pigmentation despite extreme latitudes. Diet buffered the environmental challenge. This interaction between diet and sunlight is crucial. Skin color does not evolve in isolation. It responds to the total availability of vitamin D, whether sourced from light or food. Where one source was reliable, pressure on the other diminished. Seasonality added another layer of complexity. In northern regions, summers could deliver bursts of UVB sufficient for vitamin D production, but winters offered none. Skin that could efficiently synthesize vitamin D during short summer windows had an advantage. Lighter skin facilitated this efficiency. At the same time, the risks associated with UV exposure were lower. The sun's weaker intensity reduced the likelihood of folate degradation and severe DNA damage. The protective role of melanin became less critical. The cost-benefit calculation shifted. This does not mean that lighter skin evolved because sunlight was nicer or less dangerous. It evolved because the limiting factor changed. In equatorial regions, excess UV posed the greater risk. In northern regions, deficiency did. Latitude also influenced behaviour. In colder climates, clothing became essential. Covering the body reduced UV exposure further, increasing reliance on the small amount of skin left exposed, typically the face and hands. Under these conditions, lighter pigmentation in exposed areas became even more beneficial. Shelter, too, altered exposure. Spending more time indoors during harsh winters limited sunlight contact. Cultural adaptations that made life possible in cold climates also intensified selective pressure on skin to maximise what little UV was available. This interplay between biology and culture is important. Skin did not evolve in a vacuum. It evolved alongside tools, clothing, fire, and social structures. These innovations allowed humans to occupy environments that would otherwise have been inaccessible, but they also created new, selective pressures. Another factor shaping lighter skin was the reduced stability of northern environments. Ice ages periodically pushed populations southward and then allowed them to return north. These cycles introduced repeated episodes of low sunlight exposure. Over time, traits that improved vitamin D synthesis under marginal conditions were favoured. Because these changes unfolded over tens of thousands of years, they were not uniform. Some populations moved frequently. Others remained relatively stable. Some interbred extensively. Others remained isolated. The result is a patchwork of pigmentation patterns rather than a smooth gradient. This is why lighter skin tones are most common, but not exclusive in northern regions. Variation persists within populations. Individuals differ in tanning ability, baseline pigmentation, and response to sunlight. Evolution shapes distributions, not absolutes. It is also worth noting that lighter skin carries its own risks. Reduced melanin increases susceptibility to UV damage, sunburn, and skin cancer. In northern environments, these risks were historically lower due to weak sunlight and shorter exposure periods. They did not outweigh the benefits of improved vitamin D synthesis. In modern contexts, however, these trade-offs can change. Lighter-skinned individuals living in regions with intense sunlight face higher UV-related risks without protective behaviour. This reflects environmental mismatch, not biological failure. The story of lighter skin under northern skies is therefore not one of improvement or advancement. It is one of adjustment, a recalibration of balance in response to changing constraints. This perspective helps dismantle harmful narratives that have historically framed lighter skin as inherently superior or more evolved. Biology does not support such hierarchies. Lighter skin is advantageous under specific conditions. Deeper skin is advantageous under others. Neither is universally better. Both represent solutions to the same underlying problem: how to manage ultraviolet radiation while maintaining essential physiological functions. It is also important to remember that these changes did not occur instantly when humans crossed certain latitudes. Skin colour lagged behind migration. Populations often lived for generations in environments where their inherited pigmentation was not optimal. Cultural strategies helped bridge the gap. Fire allowed warmth. Clothing reduced exposure. Diet compensated for deficiencies. These tools bought time for biological adaptation to occur slowly, if at all. In many cases, cultural solutions reduced selective pressure enough that pigmentation stabilized without fully optimizing for latitude. This is why modern populations often display a mix of traits reflecting both ancient and more recent environments. Under northern skies, lighter skin emerged not because darkness was undesirable, but because light was scarce. It was a response to absence, not excess. Understanding this helps frame skin colour as a record of challenges faced rather than choices made. It reflects where ancestors lived, how long they stayed, what they ate, and how they adapted behaviourally. As this picture becomes clearer, it naturally raises further questions. If skin colour reflects such a delicate balance, why does it change so slowly? Why do populations retain pigmentation patterns long after moving to new environments? And how does migration complicate these trends? Once the role of sunlight and skin begins to make sense, another layer quietly comes into focus, one that operates mostly out of sight, but has had enormous influence over who thrived, who struggled, and how human bodies negotiated different environments. That layer is vitamin D, a molecule that sits at the intersection of light biology and survival, shaping skin colour not through dramatic effects, but through subtle trade-offs that played out over many generations. Vitamin D is often talked about today as a supplement, a number on a blood test, or something people are vaguely told they might be low in during winter. That modern framing can make it feel optional or minor. In reality, for most of human history, vitamin D was a quiet gatekeeper. Enough of it, and bodies developed normally. Too little, and fundamental systems began to falter. What makes vitamin D unusual is how it enters the body. Unlike most nutrients, it is not primarily obtained through food. Instead, it is synthesized in the skin when ultraviolet B radiation from sunlight triggers a chemical reaction involving cholesterol-derived compounds. This reaction produces a precursor that is then modified by the liver and kidneys into its active form. Without sufficient UVB exposure, this process slows or stops entirely. This dependence on sunlight ties vitamin D tightly to geography. Near the equator, UVB radiation is abundant year-round. Even skin with high melanin levels allows enough ultraviolet light to penetrate to support vitamin D synthesis. In these regions, deficiency was historically rare, and the biological cost of blocking some UV radiation was minimal. Farther from the equator, that balance changes. UVB levels drop sharply with latitude, especially during winter months. At higher latitudes, the sun's angle becomes so low that much of the UVB radiation is filtered out by the atmosphere before it ever reaches the ground. For weeks or months at a time, skin-based vitamin D production can become negligible. In these conditions, vitamin D becomes a limiting factor. The body does not have large stores. Without ongoing synthesis or dietary intake, levels decline, and when they do, the effects ripple outward. In children, insufficient vitamin D disrupts bone mineralization. Bones become soft, bend under weight, and grow improperly. This condition, known as rickets, was once common in regions with low sunlight and poor diets. It does more than alter appearance. It affects mobility, strength, and overall health, reducing the likelihood that a child will survive to adulthood or reproduce successfully. In adults, deficiency weakens bones, increases fracture risk, and impairs muscle function. It also affects immune regulation, increasing vulnerability to infections. During pregnancy, low vitamin D levels can influence fetal development and maternal health, affecting outcomes long before birth. These effects matter evolutionarily because they influence survival and reproduction early in life, when selective pressures are strongest. Unlike skin cancer, which typically develops later, vitamin D deficiency can reduce fitness within a single generation. This difference helps explain why vitamin D synthesis played such a central role in shaping skin pigmentation. In regions where UVB was scarce, traits that improved vitamin D production offered immediate advantages. Lighter skin, by allowing more UVB to penetrate, increased synthesis efficiency during limited exposure windows. The trade-off was increased vulnerability to UV damage, but in low UV environments that risk was comparatively small. Sunburns were less severe, for light degradation was reduced, DNA damage accumulated more slowly. The protective benefits of melanin mattered less than the cost of blocking too much light. This trade-off did not produce a single optimal solution. It produced a range of workable balances. Different populations settled into different points along that spectrum, influenced by diet, behaviour, and climate. Diet plays a particularly important role here. Some foods contain vitamin D naturally, especially fatty fish, marine mammals, egg yolks, and liver. populations with regular access to these foods could meet much of their vitamin D requirement through diet, reducing reliance on sunlight. This dietary buffer explains why some high-latitude populations did not evolve extremely light skin. In Arctic and subarctic regions, traditional diets rich in fish and marine animals provided enough vitamin D to offset low UV exposure. In these contexts, the pressure to reduce melanin production was weaker. By contrast, populations that adopted agricultural diets low in vitamin D face stronger pressure. Grains and plant-based foods provide little of this nutrient. As farming spread into northern regions, dietary vitamin D intake often declined. Under these conditions, skin-based synthesis became more important, intensifying selection for lighter pigmentation. This interaction between diet and skin highlights how biological and cultural evolution intertwine. Skin colour did not evolve in isolation. It evolved alongside subsistence strategies, technologies, and social practices that shaped nutrient availability. Clothing further complicated the picture. In cold climates, covering the body was essential for survival. But clothing also reduced skin exposure to sunlight, further limiting vitamin D synthesis. This effect concentrated pressure on exposed areas like the face and hands, making pigmentation in those regions particularly important. Shelter and indoor living amplified this effect. Spending more time inside reduced exposure even during sunny periods. These cultural adaptations, while necessary, unintentionally intensified selective pressure on skin to make the most of limited UV exposure. Seasonality added another dimension. In many northern regions, summer offered a brief window of relatively intense UVB exposure. Skin that could efficiently synthesize vitamin D during this short period had an advantage. Lighter skin facilitated rapid production, helping build stores to carry through winter. However, vitamin D storage is limited. This constraint meant that even efficient synthesis could not fully compensate for long winters without dietary support. As a result, populations balanced multiple strategies rather than relying on a single solution. These subtle trade-offs did not produce dramatic shifts from one generation to the next. They nudged populations gradually. Small differences in survival and reproduction accumulated. Over thousands of years, average pigmentation shifted. It's important to emphasize that these changes were probabilistic, not deterministic. Lighter skin did not guarantee better health. Darker skin did not doom individuals in low UV environments. Variation within populations ensured that many people with different pigmentation levels survived and reproduced. Evolution operates on averages and tendencies, not certainties. It shapes distributions rather than outcomes for individuals. This nuance is often lost in simplified explanations. Skin colour is sometimes presented as a direct adaptation to vitamin D needs, as if evolution optimized it perfectly. In reality, the solutions are imperfect and context-dependent. Skin colour reflects compromises, not ideals. Modern life has altered many of the original constraints. Vitamin D supplements are widely available. Fortified foods provide dietary sources. Medical care treats bone disorders. These interventions reduce the fitness consequences that once drove selection. As a result, the relationship between skin colour and vitamin D has shifted. People with darker skin living at high latitudes may face higher risk of deficiency without supplementation. People with lighter skin living near the equator may face higher risk of UV damage without protection. These mismatches reflect environmental change rather than biological inadequacy. Understanding vitamin D as part of a system of trade-offs helps clarify why no skin tone is universally optimal. Each represents a balance tuned to particular conditions that may no longer apply. It also helps dismantle simplistic narratives that frame lighter skin as an advancement or darker skin as a disadvantage. Biology does not support such hierarchies. What matters is fit to environment, and environments vary. The story of vitamin D is a reminder that survival often depends on invisible factors. The most consequential pressures are not always the most obvious. A molecule synthesized quietly in the skin, influencing bone strength and immune function, can shape populations just as powerfully as predators or climate. It also highlights the importance of timing. Pressures that affect early development and reproduction exert far greater influence than those that act later. This timing explains why some risks mattered evolutionarily and others did not, even if they loom large in modern health discussions. When viewed this way, skin pigmentation becomes less about colour and more about function. It is part of a system designed to manage light in service of deeper physiological needs. This system is not static. It continues to interact with changing environments, behaviours, and technologies. But its history remains written on the body, visible even when its original purpose is obscured. Long before borders were drawn on maps or places were given fixed names, human life was defined by movement. Groups shifted gradually across landscapes, following food, water, animals, and seasons. Sometimes they moved because conditions changed, sometimes because curiosity pushed them onward, sometimes because staying put was no longer possible. Whatever the reason, migration has been a constant feature of human history, and skin has always moved along with it, carrying the biological memory of places left behind into new environments with different demands. This movement is essential to understanding why skin colour does not always line up neatly with geography today. Skin does not reset when people relocate. It does not immediately recalibrate to new sunlight conditions. Instead, it lags behind, shaped by environments experienced over thousands of years, not by a single lifetime or even several generations. Migration, therefore, creates moments of mismatch, periods where inherited traits encounter unfamiliar conditions and must be managed through behaviour rather than biology. When early humans began leaving Africa, they did not disperse evenly in all directions at once. Migration occurred in waves, pauses, and detours. Some groups moved slowly, stopping for generations in one region before continuing. Others followed coastlines, some crossed mountains, others turned back. These paths mattered because they determined how long populations were exposed to certain environments and how much opportunity there was for biological adaptation to occur. Skin pigmentation reflects this history. Populations that remained for long periods in regions with particular sunlight conditions show clearer alignment between skin tone and latitude. Populations that moved more recently or more rapidly often show a blend of traits that reflect earlier environments rather than current ones. This explains why skin colour can feel out of place when viewed without context. It also explains why assumptions based on appearance often fail. Migration introduces time into the equation, not just where people are, but how long they have been there. Evolutionary change requires persistence. A population must experience the same pressures consistently over many generations for traits to shift significantly. When movement interrupts that consistency, adaptation slows or stalls. Skin remains tuned to old conditions while bodies adjust behaviourally to new ones. This behavioural adjustment has always been one of humanity's greatest strengths. When skin and sunlight did not align, people compensated. They sought shade or sun, they altered clothing, they changed diets, they built shelters. These responses reduced immediate risk and allowed survival without requiring rapid biological change. As a result, many populations lived for extended periods in environments where their inherited pigmentation was not optimal, but workable. This is not a failure of evolution. It is evidence of flexibility. Consider populations that moved northward relatively quickly after leaving Africa. Their skin, shaped under intense sunlight, encountered weaker UV conditions. Vitamin D synthesis became more difficult. Rather than immediate genetic change, early solutions likely involved behaviour, spending more time outdoors during favourable seasons, adjusting clothing, consuming vitamin D-rich foods when available. Only after long residence in these regions did lighter pigmentation become more common, and even then the change was gradual and incomplete. Migration had diluted the pressure by shortening exposure time and introducing variability. The reverse situation also occurred. Populations with lighter skin moved into regions with intense sunlight. This increased UV exposure raised the risk of damage, but again, behaviour provided buffering. Shade, clothing, altered activity patterns, and later, cultural practices reduced exposure. Skin did not need to darken immediately for survival to be possible. These buffering strategies explain why skin colour did not homogenize quickly, even when humans spread across the globe. Culture bought time. Biology followed slowly, if at all. Migration also brought mixing. When groups met, intermarried and merged, their traits blended. Skin pigmentation, being polygenic, responds particularly well to mixing. Children of parents with different pigmentation often show intermediate tones, though variation can be wide. Over generations, mixing smooths extremes and increases diversity within populations. This mixing disrupts simple geographic patterns. Regions that served as crossroads often show wide ranges of skin tones regardless of latitude. Trade routes, migration corridors, and coastal hubs accumulated genetic diversity, reflecting movement rather than static adaptation. The Mediterranean region is one example. Situated between Africa, Europe, and Asia, it has long been a zone of movement. Skin tones there span a wide range, shaped by both sunlight and millennia of migration and mixing. Similar patterns appear in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of the Americas. In the Americas, migration history is particularly important. Indigenous populations arrived relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Their ancestors migrated from Northeast Asia across Beringia during periods of low sea level. This journey exposed them to cold, low UV environments for extended periods. As a result, many indigenous American populations developed pigmentation patterns reflecting northern origins, even after settling in regions closer to the equator. Because this migration occurred over a limited timescale and involved repeated movement, adaptation to new latitudes was incomplete. Skin carried a memory of earlier environments that persisted long after arrival. This persistence often surprises people who expect skin colour to match current location, but it makes sense when viewed through the lens of time and movement rather than static geography. Colonial-era migrations added another layer. Over the past few centuries, people have moved across continents at unprecedented speed. Enslavement, colonization, trade, and industrialization relocated millions of people far from ancestral environments within a few generations. Skin did not have time to adapt biologically. Instead, mismatches became common. Modern global cities now contain people with skin tones shaped by every latitude living side by side under the same sky. This arrangement is historically recent and biologically novel. It underscores how slow evolutionary change is compared to social change. In this context, skin colour becomes increasingly decoupled from environment. The old signals remain, but their predictive value diminishes. Skin still reflects history, but that history may be distant from present conditions. This decoupling has health implications. Vitamin D deficiency, UV-related skin damage, and other issues arise when inherited pigmentation encounters unfamiliar sunlight regimes. Addressing these issues requires understanding biology without assuming intent or design. Migration also highlights the limits of categorization. When people move and mix, boundaries blur, skin tones overlap, variation increases. Attempts to classify humans into rigid groups based on pigmentation become increasingly untenable. This reality clashes with social habits of categorization. Humans like clear labels. Skin does not provide them. The movement of people also means that skin is always in transition, even when biology is not actively changing. The meaning assigned to skin shifts with context. In one place, a particular tone may be common and unremarkable. In another, it may be rare and highly visible. These shifts affect social experience but do not alter biological function. Understanding migration helps separate these layers. Skin color has a biological origin rooted in adaptation to sunlight. Its social meaning arises from historical and cultural contexts that change rapidly as people move. The concept of skin on the move captures this dynamic. Skin carries a record of past environments into new ones. It does not erase that record simply because the surroundings change. Instead, it relies on behavior, culture, and technology to bridge gaps. This reliance is not new. It has always been part of the human strategy. Biological adaptation is slow by design. Cultural adaptation is fast. Together they allow survival across diverse conditions. In many cases, cultural adaptation reduces selective pressure enough that biological change never completes. This is why some populations retain pigmentation patterns that do not align perfectly with latitude even after long residence. The pressure is softened, not eliminated, and evolution responds accordingly. It is also why modern discussions of skin color must account for movement. Without migration, patterns would be simpler. With migration, they become layered and complex. The story of skin color is therefore not just a story of sunlight and chemistry. It is a story of footsteps, journeys, pauses, and crossings, of people carrying their bodies into new light and finding ways to live there. As this movement continues, the patterns will keep changing, though likely more through mixing than through new adaptations. Global mobility ensures that skin color will become even less tied to geography over time. This does not make the history irrelevant. It makes it more important to understand. Skin still reflects where people came from, even when it no longer predicts where they're going. When people think about change in the human body, they often imagine it happening quickly. Muscles strengthen after weeks of use, skin tans after days in the sun, hair turns grey over a few decades. These visible, familiar changes can create the impression that the body is highly responsive, ready to adjust itself rapidly whenever conditions shift. But the changes that shape populations rather than individuals operate on a very different timescale, one that is slow enough to be almost invisible from within a single lifetime. Skin color belongs to that slower category. It does not transform when people migrate. It does not adjust dramatically when climates change within a few generations. It does not follow fashion, preference, or convenience. Instead, it moves at the pace of inheritance, nudged forward only when certain traits consistently influence survival and reproduction over long periods. This is why skin color changes slowly, not suddenly, even when people find themselves living under very different skies than those their ancestors knew. To understand this, it helps to separate two processes that often get confused. One is physiological response, the other is evolutionary change. Physiological responses happen within an individual. Tanning is a good example. When skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation, melanocytes increase melanin production. The skin darkens. This happens because cells respond to signals triggered by UV exposure. When exposure decreases, melanin production slows and the skin lightens again. This response is flexible and reversible. It does not alter the genes that person passes on. Evolutionary change, by contrast, occurs across generations. It involves shifts in gene frequencies within a population. For skin color to change evolutionarily, individuals with certain pigmentation-related genetic variants must, on average, leave more surviving offspring than those without them. This difference must persist long enough for those variants to become more common. This process is inherently slow. Each generation represents only one opportunity for selection to act. Even strong selective pressures take many generations to produce noticeable changes. When pressures are subtle, as they often are with skin pigmentation, the process stretches out further. Sunlight-related pressures are rarely absolute. Darker skin in low UV environments does not make survival impossible. Lighter skin in high UV environments does not guarantee failure. Instead, differences tend to influence probabilities. Slightly higher risk of deficiency, slightly greater chance of damage, slightly altered reproductive outcomes. These small differences accumulate slowly. This accumulation explains why populations can live for thousands of years in environments where their inherited skin colour is not perfectly matched to local conditions. Culture, behaviour and technology buffer the mismatch. Clothing, shelter, diet and social practices reduce the strength of selection, slowing genetic change even further. Another reason skin colour changes slowly is its genetic complexity. Pigmentation is controlled by many genes, each contributing a small effect. Some genes influence melanin production. Others affect melanosome size, shape and transport. Still others regulate how melanocytes respond to UV signals. Because so many genes are involved, shifting overall skin tone requires coordinated changes across multiple genetic pathways. This polygenic structure makes large, rapid shifts unlikely. Even if one gene variant becomes more common, its effect may be modest unless accompanied by changes in others. The result is gradual movement rather than abrupt transition. Inheritance patterns also matter. Skin colour is influenced by additive effects, meaning traits blend rather than switch. When populations mix, offspring often show intermediate pigmentation. This blending further slows directional change by maintaining variation. Migration amplifies this effect. When people move and mix with other groups, new genetic combinations appear. These combinations may not align strongly with local selective pressures, especially if movement continues. Constant gene flow between populations counteracts the tendency toward local adaptation. This dynamic helps explain why skin colour gradients are smooth rather than sharply defined. Where movement and mixing occur, boundaries blur. Selection nudges averages but does not eliminate diversity. It also explains why modern populations often display wide ranges of skin tone within the same geographic area. Global mobility has dramatically increased gene flow. Selection related to sunlight has weakened due to cultural buffering. The conditions required for strong, consistent directional change rarely exist. Even in the deep past, conditions were rarely stable enough for rapid adaptation. Climate fluctuated. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Vegetation shifted. Human groups moved repeatedly. These changes interrupted selection, preventing traits from reaching extremes. Consider a population moving northward during a warmer period. Lighter skin might begin to confer a slight advantage. But if climate cools further, prompting migration southward, that advantage may disappear or reverse. The selective signal becomes inconsistent. Traits stall mid-transition. This stop-and-start pattern leaves its mark. Skin colour often reflects a compromise shaped by multiple phases of movement, rather than a single, continuous exposure to one environment. Another factor slowing change is that selection related to skin pigmentation often acts indirectly. Skin colour itself is not usually the target. The target is vitamin D status, folate preservation, or DNA integrity. Skin colour influences these outcomes, but it is not the only factor involved. Diet can compensate, behaviour can mitigate, social structures can protect vulnerable individuals. These alternatives reduce the selective pressure on pigmentation genes, allowing variation to persist. Selection also acts unevenly across age groups. Traits that affect early development and reproduction matter more than those that act later. Some consequences of skin pigmentation, such as skin cancer risk, tend to manifest after reproductive age. This reduces their impact on gene frequencies, slowing evolutionary response. The result is a system where skin colour evolves only when pressures are strong, consistent and unavoidable. Such conditions existed in some regions for long periods, which is why broad patterns emerged. But even there, the process took tens of thousands of years. This slow pace contrasts sharply with how quickly social meanings attached to skin colour can change. Cultural narratives can arise within decades. Social hierarchies can form within centuries. These timelines are fast compared to biology. This mismatch often leads people to assume that visible differences must reflect deep, ancient divisions. In reality, skin colour differences are among the most recent and superficial variations in human evolution. Genetically, all modern humans are closely related. The traits that distinguish populations externally represent a tiny fraction of our shared biology. Skin colour stands out visually, but it sits on top of an otherwise remarkably uniform species. The slowness of change also explains why skin colour remains stable across families, even when individuals live in different environments. A child born to parents with dark skin does not inherit lighter skin, simply because they grow up in a low UV region. The genes passed on reflect ancestry, not immediate surroundings. Only after many generations of differential survival and reproduction would averages begin to shift. This reality sometimes clashes with intuition. People expect adaptation to be quick because they experience short-term adjustment daily. But evolutionary adaptation is cumulative, statistical, and indifferent to individual experience. Understanding this distinction helps clarify why skin colour should never be used as a proxy for where someone belongs or what environment they are meant to inhabit. Skin reflects where ancestors lived long enough for slow change to occur, not where individuals currently live. It also helps explain why global movement has not produced uniform pigmentation despite centuries of migration. The timescale is simply too short. Cultural buffering is too strong. Gene flow is too constant. In the future, if humans were to remain in fixed locations for tens of thousands of years under stable conditions without technological intervention, pigmentation patterns might shift again. But modern life makes such scenarios unlikely. Technology alters exposure. Medicine mitigates consequences. Migration continues. Skin colour is therefore entering a new phase of its story, one where biology lags far behind environment and culture. The old pressures still exist, but they are filtered through layers of behaviour and choice. This does not mean evolution has stopped. It means its direction and intensity have changed. Subtle shifts may still occur, but they will be difficult to detect against the background of global mixing. Recognizing the slow pace of skin colour change reframes the entire discussion. It moves the focus away from assumptions about adaptation and toward an appreciation of history, movement, and constraint. Skin is not a quick response system. It is a long-term record. That record is written patiently, generation by generation, shaped by forces that act quietly rather than dramatically. It reminds us that what we see on the surface today reflects choices made by no one, pressures felt by everyone, and time moving forward far more slowly than our expectations usually allow. When thinking about human skin and its relationship to sunlight, it can be tempting to imagine a direct line between environment and biology, as if climate alone dictated outcomes and the body simply followed along. But humans have never been passive occupants of their environments. From very early on, we altered the conditions we lived in, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Climate shaped us, yes, but we also learned how to soften its edges, and one of the most powerful tools we developed for doing that was culture. Culture, in this sense, is not art or language or ritual, though those matter too. It is the collection of behaviours, technologies, and shared practices that allow humans to survive in places where raw biology might struggle. Clothing, shelter, fire, diet, daily routines, and social organisation all fall into this category. Together they changed how skin interacted with the environment and in doing so altered the evolutionary pressures that once acted more directly on pigmentation. Climate sets the stage, but culture rearranges the furniture. Early humans evolved in warm environments where minimal clothing was sufficient. Skin was regularly exposed to sunlight. The balance between ultraviolet radiation, melanin, folate protection, and vitamin D synthesis played out largely without interference. But as humans moved into colder regions, climate demanded new solutions. Lower temperatures, wind, snow, and seasonal extremes made bare skin impractical and dangerous. Clothing became essential. The moment clothing entered the picture, the relationship between skin and sunlight changed. Covered skin no longer received direct UV exposure. Vitamin D synthesis became concentrated in whatever areas remained uncovered, usually the face and hands. The rest of the body, protected from cold and injury, was also shielded from light. This shift did not happen all at once, or in the same way everywhere. Early clothing was likely simple, made from animal hides or plant fibres, offering varying degrees of coverage. Over time, as technology improved, garments became more effective at insulation and protection. In colder climates, covering more skin for longer periods became the norm. This cultural adaptation altered selective pressure. In low UV environments where sunlight was already scarce, clothing further reduced exposure. The cost of high melanin levels increased because less UV reached the skin overall. Under these conditions, lighter pigmentation in exposed areas became more advantageous, helping maximize vitamin D production from limited light. At the same time, clothing reduced the risks associated with lighter skin. Covered skin was protected from sunburn and UV damage. The trade-off shifted. Biology responded, but slowly, as always, and only where cultural buffering did not eliminate pressure entirely. Shelter worked in a similar way. As humans built more permanent structures, spent more time indoors, and relied on fire for warmth and cooking, exposure to sunlight decreased further. This was especially true during winter months, when people stayed inside for longer periods. Again, the effect was to reduce UV exposure regardless of latitude. Daily routines mattered as well. Work patterns, hunting schedules, and social activities determined how much time people spent outdoors and at what times of day. In hot climates, activity often shifted to early morning or evening to avoid intense midday sun. In cold climates, daylight hours were precious and sometimes fully used, but weather conditions limited exposure. All of these behaviours interacted with skin biology. They did not replace it, but they reshaped the conditions under which it mattered. Diet was another powerful cultural modifier. As discussed earlier, access to vitamin D-rich foods could offset low UV exposure. This meant that populations with reliable dietary sources experienced weaker selective pressure on skin pigmentation. Cultural practices around food acquisition, preservation, and sharing directly influenced biological outcomes. The development of agriculture marked a major shift here. Farming allowed populations to grow larger and more sedentary, but it often reduced dietary diversity. In many regions, agricultural diets were low in vitamin D. This increased reliance on skin-based synthesis and intensified pressure for lighter pigmentation in low UV environments. However, agriculture also supported denser settlements and more complex social structures. These, in turn, increased indoor living and clothing use, further reducing sunlight exposure. The net effect depended on how these factors balanced out in specific regions. It is important to recognise that cultural adaptations do not act uniformly across a population. Access to clothing, quality of shelter, and diet often varied by age, status, and role. Children, for example, might spend more time outdoors. Adults engaged in certain tasks might be more exposed to sunlight. These differences influenced who experienced which pressures and when. Over time, these patterns could shape selection in subtle ways, favouring traits that worked well within the dominant cultural context rather than the raw environment. Climate itself is not static. Ice ages, warming periods, droughts, and shifts in vegetation altered living conditions repeatedly. Cultural flexibility allowed humans to remain in regions through these changes without immediate biological adaptation. When climate cooled, clothing and fire compensated. When climate warmed, shelter and altered activity patterns helped manage heat. This buffering effect slowed biological change. Skin colour did not need to adjust fully to every climatic fluctuation, because culture absorbed much of the impact. As a result, pigmentation patterns often reflect long-term averages rather than short-term extremes. This helps explain why skin colour gradients are broad and stable rather than finely tuned to every local variation. Culture smooths the landscape of selection. It also explains why skin colour does not perfectly predict health outcomes in modern contexts. The environments that shaped pigmentation often no longer exist in their original form. Artificial heating, air conditioning, indoor work, electric lighting, sunscreen and dietary supplements have all altered how skin interacts with climate. These technologies reduce the relevance of pigmentation for survival, but they do not erase its history. Skin still carries the imprint of past conditions even when present conditions are radically different. Cultural adaptation also plays a role in how skin is perceived. Clothing styles, beauty standards, and social norms influence how visible skin tone is and how it is interpreted. These interpretations can feed back into behaviour, affecting sun exposure and health practices. For example, cultural preferences for lighter or darker skin can influence time spent outdoors, clothing choices, and use of sun protection. These behaviours can have health consequences independent of biology. They also illustrate how meaning can shape interaction with environment as much as physical need. It is crucial to keep these layers separate. Biological adaptation explains why skin colour emerged and changed slowly over time. Cultural adaptation explains how humans managed mismatches between skin and environment without requiring immediate genetic change. Social interpretation explains how skin colour came to carry meanings far beyond its biological role. Confusing these layers leads to misunderstanding. Treating skin colour as destiny ignores cultural buffering. Treating it as purely social ignores its evolutionary roots. A clearer picture emerges when all three are acknowledged. Climate sets constraints, but culture determines how those constraints are experienced. Skin responds to the combined effect, not to climate alone. This interplay also highlights human ingenuity. Rather than waiting for biology to catch up, humans changed their behaviour. They did not need to evolve fur to survive cold climates. They made clothing. They did not need to evolve nocturnal vision to extend their days. They made fire and light. These innovations allowed humans to occupy environments far outside the range that raw biology would permit. In doing so, they altered the selective landscape for traits like skin pigmentation, slowing or redirecting change. The result is a species whose visible traits often reflect a compromise between ancient environments and more recent cultural solutions. Skin colour is one of the clearest examples of this compromise. In modern societies, cultural adaptation has become so effective that it nearly overwhelms biological adaptation. People with any skin tone can live almost anywhere with appropriate technology. The evolutionary pressures that once shaped pigmentation are now weak or inconsistent. This does not mean biology no longer matters. It means that understanding biology requires understanding culture as well. When considering skin colour across the world, climate alone cannot explain the patterns. Neither can sunlight in isolation. Clothing, shelter, diet, and daily life all intervened, sometimes reinforcing environmental pressures, sometimes counteracting them. These interventions were not planned with evolution in mind. They arose from immediate needs and creativity. Their long-term effects on biology were unintended but profound. It's very easy, when looking back at patterns in the natural world, to imagine that they were planned. When something appears orderly, consistent, or well matched to its surroundings, the human mind reaches almost automatically for ideas like purpose, intention, or design. Skin colour, with its broad alignment to latitude and sunlight, often triggers that instinct. It can feel as though humanity was guided toward different appearances, as if evolution had a goal in mind and moved populations deliberately toward it. But that feeling is a projection, not a reflection of how evolution actually works. Evolution does not plan. It does not anticipate. It does not aim for outcomes or optimize toward future conditions. It does not care what will be useful later or what will look sensible in hindsight. Evolution operates without intention or direction, and understanding that fact is essential for understanding why human skin looks the way it does. At its core, evolution is a process driven by variation, inheritance, and differential survival and reproduction. Small genetic differences arise randomly through mutation. These differences are passed on, shuffled, and recombined through reproduction. In a given environment, some of those differences happen to influence how well individuals survive and reproduce. Over time, variants that are associated with slightly better outcomes become more common. That's it. There is no foresight in the system, only accumulation. Skin pigmentation fits neatly into this framework. Variations in genes that influence melanin production did not arise because they were needed. They arose because mutations happen. Most mutations have little or no effect. Some are harmful. A few happen to alter traits in ways that interact with the environment. In regions with intense sunlight, some of those variations resulted in higher melanin production. In that context, those variations reduced UV-related damage and preserved folate levels. Individuals carrying them were slightly more likely to have healthy offspring. Over many generations, those variants increased in frequency, not because darker skin was a goal, but because it worked better under those conditions. When humans moved into regions with weaker sunlight, a different subset of existing variations became relevant. Mutations that reduced melanin production, altered melanosome behavior, or changed regulatory pathways allowed more UV penetration. In low UV environments, these variants improved vitamin D synthesis. Again, individuals carrying them experienced slightly better outcomes. Over time, those variants became more common. At no point did evolution decide to lighten or darken skin. It simply filtered variation through environment. The apparent direction we see when looking backward is the result of consistent pressures applied over long periods, not a guiding force pushing populations toward a target. This distinction matters because it prevents a common misunderstanding. When people see patterns, they often assume hierarchy. If one trait appears in one place and a different trait appears in another, it is tempting to assume one is more advanced, more refined, or more evolved. Evolution does not support that interpretation. All humans alive today are equally evolved. Every population has been evolving for the same amount of time. Differences in traits reflect differences in pressures, not differences in progress. Skin color is a particularly good example, because its evolution was constrained and limited. It did not spiral endlessly darker near the equator or endlessly lighter toward the poles. It settled into ranges that were good enough under local conditions. Evolution often stops not when something is perfect, but when further change offers no additional advantage or introduces new costs. This lack of direction explains why skin color patterns are broad rather than precise. If evolution were aiming for optimal solutions, we might expect skin tone to track latitude exactly, adjusting finely to every local variation in sunlight. Instead, we see wide ranges, overlaps, and exceptions. That messiness is a hallmark of undirected processes. Evolution also works with what is already available. It cannot invent traits from scratch in response to need. It can only modify existing structures and pathways. Human skin did not evolve new pigments or radically different architectures. It adjusted the production and handling of melanin, a pigment already present in many organisms. This constraint explains why different populations sometimes reach similar outcomes through different genetic routes. Light skin in Europe and light skin in East Asia involve overlapping but distinct sets of genes. Evolution did not have a single blueprint for light skin. It found multiple ways to reduce melanin production enough to satisfy vitamin D needs under low UV conditions. The same is true for darker skin. High melanin levels arose through different genetic combinations in different populations exposed to intense sunlight. The outcome looks similar, but the underlying pathways vary. This diversity reflects the randomness of mutation filtered through similar environments, not a single directed process. Another important consequence of undirected evolution is that it produces trade-offs rather than perfect solutions. Every trait carries costs as well as benefits. High melanin protects against UV damage but reduces vitamin D synthesis. Low melanin enhances vitamin D production but increases UV sensitivity. Evolution does not eliminate these trade-offs. It balances them according to local conditions. These balances are not stable forever. When environments change, the balance shifts. But because evolution has no foresight, traits optimized for one set of conditions can become mismatched under another. This is why modern humans often experience issues related to skin and sunlight. The environment has changed faster than biology can respond. From an evolutionary perspective, this mismatch is normal. There is no expectation that traits should remain perfectly suited as conditions change. Evolution does not maintain adaptations once they stop being useful, unless they are actively selected against. This lack of intention also explains why skin colour does not respond to individual effort or desire. People sometimes wonder why skin does not change to fit a new environment within a lifetime, but evolution does not operate at the level of individual experience. It operates at the level of populations over generations. An individual can tan, supplement vitamin D, or avoid sun exposure. These actions affect health, but do not alter the genetic makeup of the population unless they influence reproductive outcomes consistently across generations. Cultural practices can reduce selection pressure so effectively that biological change never occurs. This interplay highlights another important point. Evolution is indifferent to meaning. It does not care about social categories, identities, or values. Skin pigmentation genes spread or decline based solely on how they interact with survival and reproduction in a given context. The meanings attached to skin colour arose much later, shaped by historical events, power structures, and social narratives. These meanings can feel deeply ingrained, but they have no biological basis. Evolution did not encode significance into skin tone. Humans imposed it afterward. Understanding evolution as an undirected process also clarifies why skin colour differences are relatively recent. Modern humans emerged in Africa around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. Most variation in skin pigmentation outside Africa developed within the last 50,000 years, after migration into diverse environments. In evolutionary terms, this is a short time. It explains why skin colour differences, though visible, are shallow. They sit on top of a shared genetic foundation that remains remarkably consistent across humanity. If evolution had direction or intention, we might expect deeper divergence over such time spans. Instead, we see superficial variation layered onto profound similarity. This perspective also helps explain why evolution sometimes appears to stall. In regions where cultural adaptation reduces pressure, skin colour may remain relatively stable for long periods, even if it is not perfectly matched to environment. There is no force pushing it to change unless differential survival and reproduction resume. Evolution does not mind inefficiency if it does not affect outcomes. It does not refine traits endlessly. It stops when pressures ease. This is why skin colour did not continue to lighten indefinitely in northern regions. Once vitamin D needs could be met reliably enough, further reduction in melanin would have increased UV-related risks without offering significant additional benefit. Selection balanced out. It is also why skin colour did not darken indefinitely near the equator. At some point, additional melanin would have offered diminishing returns while potentially interfering with other processes. Selection stabilized pigmentation within functional ranges. These plateaus are a natural result of undirected processes reaching equilibrium under consistent conditions. Recognizing this helps dismantle the idea that evolution produces progress. Evolution produces fit to context, nothing more. What is beneficial in one place or time may be neutral or harmful in another. Skin colour illustrates this clearly. Traits that were advantageous under ancestral conditions may now be neutral, problematic, or irrelevant. Modern health challenges related to skin and sunlight are not signs of failure. They are signs of changed conditions. Understanding evolution without intention also encourages humility. The patterns we see today are not lessons or messages. They are outcomes of countless small interactions over deep time. They do not tell us what should be. They tell us what happened. This view shifts the conversation away from judgment and toward understanding. Skin color is not something to explain in terms of value or destiny. It is something to understand in terms of process. Once skin color is understood as a biological outcome shaped by environment, movement, and undirected evolutionary processes, it becomes equally important to understand what skin color is not. Much of the confusion, harm, and misunderstanding surrounding human variation comes not from what skin color actually does, but from what it has been made to represent. These imposed meanings have accumulated over relatively short periods of history, yet they often feel older, heavier, and more inevitable than they truly are. Skin color is not a measure of human difference in any deep biological sense. This is perhaps the most important clarification to make, because it runs counter to what visual intuition suggests. Human beings are extraordinarily good at noticing surface differences. Our brains evolved to recognize faces quickly, distinguish individuals, and pick up on subtle visual cues. Skin tone, being immediately visible, becomes one of the first features processed. That immediacy can create the illusion that it reflects something fundamental. Biology does not support that illusion. From a genetic perspective, skin color accounts for a very small portion of human variation. The genes involved in pigmentation represent a tiny fraction of the human genome. Two people with very different skin tones can be more genetically similar overall than two people with similar skin tones. Most genetic diversity exists within populations, not between them. Skin color exaggerates difference visually while masking underlying similarity. This mismatch between appearance and biology is one reason skin color has been so easily misunderstood. It looks important because it is easy to see. But visibility does not equal significance. Skin color is also not a reliable indicator of ancestry in any precise sense. While broad patterns exist, individual histories are complex. Migration, mixing, and recombination mean that skin tone alone cannot tell you where someone's ancestors lived or what paths they took. Similar pigmentation can arise through different genetic routes in unrelated populations. Different pigmentation can exist within the same family. Trying to read ancestry from skin color is like trying to infer a book's content from the color of its cover. It may hint at something vague, but it cannot provide detail or certainty. Skin color is not a marker of intelligence, ability, or character. There is no biological mechanism linking pigmentation genes to cognitive capacity, creativity, moral reasoning, or emotional depth. These traits are influenced by a complex interplay of genetics, development, environment, education, nutrition, and social context. Skin color does not participate in those processes in any meaningful way. The idea that it does arose historically from attempts to justify unequal treatment, not from evidence. When society sought to rank groups, visible traits provided convenient anchors for storytelling. Skin color, being both visible and variable, became an easy focal point. But ease of use does not equal truth. Modern genetics has repeatedly confirmed that traits like intelligence are influenced by thousands of genes interacting with environment. None of these relationships align with pigmentation categories. Any attempt to link skin color with mental or behavioral traits is not only incorrect, but fundamentally misunderstands how biology works. Skin color is not a boundary between groups. Despite centuries of classification systems built around pigmentation, there is no point at which humanity divides cleanly along color lines. Skin tone varies continuously. There are no natural breaks, no clear thresholds where one category ends and another begins. Any lines drawn are artificial, imposed for convenience or control. This continuity reflects how skin color evolved. It changed gradually across geography, shaped by gradients of sunlight and time, not by discrete jumps. Migration and mixing further smoothed those gradients. Nature did not create boxes, humans did. Because these categories are social constructs rather than biological realities, they vary across cultures and historical periods. What one society defines as distinct, another may group together. The boundaries shift because they are not grounded in biology. Skin colour is also not a stable identity marker across time. Even within an individual life, skin tone can change. Sun exposure, age, health, hormonal shifts, and injury all influence pigmentation. Across generations, mixing further alters appearance. A person's grandchildren may not resemble them in the same way. Skin does not preserve identity with precision. This instability contrasts with how skin colour has often been treated socially, as if it were fixed, permanent and definitive. Biology tells a different story. Pigmentation is dynamic at the individual level, and fluid at the population level. Skin colour is not destiny. This misconception arises when people assume that biological traits determine outcomes independent of context. While skin pigmentation can influence how the body interacts with sunlight, it does not determine health, success, or experience on its own. Diet, environment, medical care, social conditions, and personal choices play enormous roles. Where skin colour does intersect with outcomes, it often does so because of social responses rather than biological necessity. Health disparities associated with skin colour frequently reflect unequal access to care, environmental exposure, stress, and discrimination, not inherent biological differences. Confusing social consequences with biological causes leads to misplaced conclusions. Skin colour did not create inequality. Inequality exploited skin colour. Skin colour is not a measure of how adapted someone is to a place in a moral or absolute sense. It is tempting to think of skin tone as a sign that someone belongs somewhere, that their body is somehow meant for a particular environment. But adaptation is always relative, conditional, and historical. Skin reflects past environments experienced by ancestors, not present suitability or entitlement. In the modern world, technology and culture allow people of any skin tone to live almost anywhere. The idea of biological belonging based on pigmentation no longer applies in a meaningful way, if it ever did. Bodies adapt behaviourally long before biology catches up. Skin colour is not evidence of separate human origins. All modern humans share a recent common ancestry. The differences in skin pigmentation developed after humans began migrating out of Africa. They are among the most recent adaptations in our evolutionary history, not ancient divisions. This fact undermines any claim that skin colour represents fundamentally different types of humans. The timeline simply does not support it. By the time pigmentation differences became pronounced, humans were already fully modern in anatomy, cognition and behaviour. Skin colour is also not a clear guide to health needs without context. While pigmentation influences vitamin D synthesis and UV sensitivity, these effects depend on environment, lifestyle and diet. Two people with the same skin tone living in different places may face different health considerations. Conversely, two people with different skin tones living in the same place may require similar interventions. Treating skin colour as a standalone health indicator leads to oversimplification. Effective care requires understanding exposure, behaviour, and individual variation, not assumptions based on appearance. Skin colour is not a language the body uses to communicate meaning. The body does not signal values, worth, or identity through pigmentation. It responds to photons, nutrients, and temperature. Meaning enters the picture only when humans interpret what they see. This distinction matters because it shifts responsibility. Biology did not create prejudice. Humans did. Biology did not assign rank. Humans did. Skin colour was recruited into social systems long after it evolved for entirely different reasons. Understanding what skin colour is not does not erase its impact on lived experience. Social meanings are real because people act on them. But separating biological fact from social fiction allows those meanings to be questioned rather than accepted as natural. It also helps dismantle the idea that differences must be explained or justified. Skin colour does not require explanation in moral terms. It does not need to be defended or rationalised. It simply exists as one of many traits shaped by history and environment. This clarity opens space for a more grounded understanding of human variation, one that neither exaggerates difference nor denies it. Skin colour varies. It matters biologically in specific limited ways. It has been made to matter socially in far broader ways. Those two truths can coexist without being confused. Recognizing what skin colour is not helps clear away assumptions that obscure the real story. It brings the focus back to adaptation, movement, and time, rather than hierarchy or destiny. Walk through any modern city, and you will see something that would have been almost unimaginable for most of human history. People whose ancestors evolved under radically different skies, climates, and conditions now live side by side, sharing the same streets, the same buildings, the same artificial light, and often the same daily routines. Skin tones shaped by equatorial sun, northern winters, coastal diets, high altitudes, and ancient migrations now coexist within a few square kilometres. From the outside, it looks like a new world, but biologically those bodies are still carrying very old patterns. Modern humans live in environments that are profoundly different from the ones that shaped their skin. Yet the skin itself has not caught up. It could not, even if it wanted to. The timescales do not match. Evolution works in tens of thousands of years. Modern life has transformed conditions in a few centuries, sometimes in just a few decades. The result is a species living in the present with bodies tuned to the past. This mismatch is not a flaw. It is an expected consequence of how evolution operates. Human skin still reflects ancient patterns because those patterns were shaped slowly, under conditions that were stable for long periods. Sunlight regimes did not change dramatically from one generation to the next. Diets shifted, but often gradually. Migration occurred, but it unfolded over long timescales compared to the pace of modern transportation. Under those circumstances, pigmentation patterns had time to settle into functional ranges. Today, those stabilizing conditions are gone. Artificial lighting has extended days far beyond sunset. Indoor work has reduced sunlight exposure even in sunny regions. Climate control has flattened seasonal extremes. Clothing is worn year-round in nearly all environments. Sunscreen alters UV exposure intentionally rather than incidentally. Diets are global, processed, and supplemented. None of this resembles the world in which skin colour evolved, and yet the skin remains. This persistence can feel puzzling if skin colour is thought of as a current adaptation. But it makes sense once skin is understood as a historical record rather than a live adjustment system. Skin does not respond to modern conditions by changing genetically because those conditions have not been present long enough or consistently enough to drive selection. Cultural solutions have intervened too effectively. A person born today inherits pigmentation patterns shaped by ancestors who lived under very different skies. That inheritance is not corrected by moving to a new place. It is only modified at the surface through tanning or protection. The deeper genetic architecture remains unchanged. This reality explains many features of modern health that might otherwise seem confusing. Vitamin D deficiency, for example, is common in populations with darker skin living at high latitudes. Biologically, this makes sense. Those pigmentation patterns evolved under intense sunlight where vitamin D synthesis was easy. In low UV environments, the same traits reduce synthesis efficiency. This is not evidence that those bodies are unsuited to their current environment in any moral or absolute sense. It is evidence that the environment has changed faster than biology. Cultural solutions such as supplementation and dietary fortification address the mismatch effectively. Biology does not need to change for health to be maintained. The reverse mismatch also appears. People with very light skin living in regions with intense sunlight face higher risks of UV damage. Their skin evolved under weak UV conditions where such damage was rare. In equatorial environments, the same traits require behavioral protection to avoid harm. Again, culture provides the solution. Clothing, shade, sunscreen, and altered activity patterns reduce risk. Biology remains as it is. These examples illustrate a broader point. Modern humans no longer rely on skin colour for survival in the way their ancestors did. The trait still influences how bodies interact with sunlight, but it no longer determines who thrives or fails in a given place. That role has been taken over by technology, medicine, and social organisation. Because of this, selective pressure on skin pigmentation has weakened dramatically. In many parts of the world, it may be close to neutral. People with a wide range of skin tones can survive and reproduce equally well under the same conditions. When selection weakens, traits persist largely unchanged. This persistence is often mistaken for significance. People assume that because skin colour remains visible and stable, it must still be biologically decisive. In reality, it is biologically residual. It matters in specific contexts, but it no longer organises survival the way it once did. Modern genetic studies reinforce this view. The genes associated with skin pigmentation show signatures of past selection, but relatively little evidence of ongoing strong selection in recent populations. The major shifts have already happened. What remains is variation maintained through mixing and inheritance. That mixing has increased dramatically in recent centuries. Migration has accelerated, barriers have fallen, intermarriage has become more common in many regions. As a result, skin tones are blending in ways that would have been rare or impossible in the past. This blending does not erase ancient patterns immediately. It reshuffles them. Children inherit combinations of pigmentation genes that reflect multiple ancestral environments. The resulting skin tones may not align clearly with any single geographic history. Over time, this mixing may reduce extremes and increase diversity within populations. But even this process unfolds slowly. It will take many generations for global mixing to significantly alter average pigmentation patterns, and only if movement remains consistent. Meanwhile, social meanings attached to skin colour continue to change far more rapidly. Laws, norms, and cultural narratives shift within decades. These changes can feel permanent, but they are fleeting compared to biological timescales. This difference in pace often creates tension. People live with bodies shaped by ancient forces in societies that interpret those bodies through modern lenses. Misunderstanding arises when ancient traits are treated as intentional signals rather than inherited records. The idea that skin colour reflects something about who a person is now, rather than where their ancestors lived long ago, persists largely because it feels intuitive. The brain likes visible cues. It uses them to categorize quickly. But intuition is not a reliable guide to biology. Ancient patterns persist not because they are meaningful in the present, but because there has been no sustained reason for them to disappear. Evolution does not erase traits simply because they are no longer central. It erases traits only when they reduce reproductive success consistently. In modern environments, skin colour rarely does that. Where it introduces risk, culture mitigates. Where it introduces advantage, that advantage is often marginal. The selective signal fades. This means that skin colour is becoming increasingly decoupled from environment. In evolutionary terms, this is a new situation. For most of human history, where you lived strongly influenced how your skin interacted with the world. Today, that link is weaker than ever before. This weakening does not mean skin colour is irrelevant. It still affects health considerations, social experience, and personal identity. But its biological role has shifted from determinant to context-dependent factor. Understanding this shift helps explain why debates about skin colour often feel disconnected from biology. Social meanings dominate because biological pressures have receded. Skin colour has become a canvas for cultural interpretation rather than a tool for survival. At the same time, the ancient patterns remain visible, reminding us that bodies carry history whether or not society acknowledges it. Skin is a living archive. It stores information about sunlight, latitude, diet, and movement long after those factors stop shaping daily life. This archival quality is not unique to skin. Many human traits reflect past environments rather than present ones. Wisdom teeth, for example, reflect diets that required more chewing. Fear responses reflect ancestral dangers rather than modern ones. Skin pigmentation belongs to this category of inherited solutions to old problems. Recognizing skin as an ancient pattern rather than a modern signal helps place it in perspective. It is neither trivial nor definitive. It is informative without being prescriptive. Modern humans are not unfinished products waiting for biology to catch up with technology. We are organisms living in a transitional moment where culture has outpaced evolution. Skin colour, like many traits, reveals that transition clearly. As environments continue to change, the gap between ancient patterns and modern conditions may widen further. Climate change, urbanisation, and global movement will continue to reshape how humans interact with sunlight and environment. Biology will respond only slowly, if at all. In that context, understanding where skin colour comes from matters more than ever. Not because it tells us who people are, but because it reminds us how recently and how gently humans diverged in appearance, and how deeply we remain connected beneath the surface. When you step back far enough to see the full arc of the story, something quietly striking comes into view. After all the discussion of sunlight, latitude, migration, culture, chemistry, and time, after tracing how skin responded to different pressures in different places, the conclusion that begins to form is not about difference at all. It is about continuity. Human skin varies, yes, but it varies on a single surface, stretched over one species, carrying a shared story that is far older and far more cohesive than the differences that first catch the eye. Every human alive today belongs to the same lineage, not metaphorically, literally. We are the descendants of a relatively small population of anatomically modern humans who lived not very long ago in evolutionary terms. Compared to many other species, our diversity is shallow. The traits that distinguish us visually, including skin colour, sit near the surface of that shared inheritance. It can be difficult to feel this truth intuitively because vision is persuasive. The brain gives enormous weight to what it can see quickly. Skin tone registers instantly. It is processed before words, before context, before history. But biology does not rank traits by how noticeable they are. It ranks them by how much they matter for survival and reproduction, and even then, only statistically and over long stretches of time. From that perspective, skin colour is a minor variation, important enough to shape adaptation to sunlight, but small compared to the systems that truly define our species: the structure of the brain, the capacity for language, the social instincts that bind groups together, the ability to imagine, plan, and pass knowledge across generations. These are the traits that unify humanity at a deep level. Skin colour is simply one of many ways that those shared bodies adjusted to different circumstances along the way. The reason skin colour feels so central is not because biology made it central, but because history did. Over the past few centuries, skin tone became entangled with systems of power, exploitation, and identity. These systems magnified a superficial trait and treated it as if it marked fundamental difference. The story of skin colour was rewritten, stripped of its environmental origins and repurposed to justify inequality. That social story feels heavy because it is recent and unresolved. But it is not the biological story. Biologically, skin colour tells a calm, almost unremarkable tale. It says that humans moved. that they stayed in some places long enough for sunlight to matter, that they adapted slowly, imperfectly, without intention, that they carried those adaptations with them when they moved again, that culture often stepped in to soften the edges of mismatch, that no trait ever became universal or absolute. It is a story without villains or heroes. No group chose its skin colour, no population earned it. No one failed to adapt out of neglect or deficiency. Skin colour emerged because bodies interacted with light, nutrients and time, nothing more. When this perspective settles in, many familiar assumptions begin to loosen. The idea that skin colour marks separate kinds of humans becomes difficult to sustain. There simply has not been enough time, enough isolation, or enough pressure for deep biological divisions to form. What we call races are not branches of humanity. They are loose clusters of traits shaped by geography and history, overlapping at the edges, blending wherever movement occurred. This blending is not a modern invention. It has always been part of the human story. Migration did not happen once. It happened again and again. Groups split, reunited, merged and separated. Genetic material flowed across populations whenever contact occurred. Skin colour, being polygenic and additive, blended readily. The result is that variation exists everywhere, even in places often imagined as homogeneous. Africa contains the greatest genetic diversity on Earth, including wide variation in skin tone. Europe contains gradients rather than uniformity. Asia encompasses some of the widest ranges of pigmentation, shaped by latitude, altitude, and migration. The Americas reflect layered histories of movement and mixing. No region fits neatly into a single shade. Seen this way, the phrase "many shades" takes on a different meaning. It does not imply division. It implies continuity. Shades exist precisely because there are no hard lines. One tone flows into the next, connected by countless intermediate forms. This continuity mirrors the deeper biological reality. At the level of DNA, humans differ by a very small percentage. Most of that variation has nothing to do with skin colour. Traits that affect metabolism, immune response, and even physical appearance beyond pigmentation vary widely within populations. Skin colour is simply one of the most visible of many traits shaped by local conditions. The emphasis placed on skin tone has therefore always been disproportionate. It is a spotlight fixed on a narrow feature, while the rest of the shared structure remains in shadow. Understanding skin colour as part of a shared story does not require minimising difference. Difference exists. It matters in specific biological contexts. It shapes lived experience through social systems. But difference does not imply separation at the species level. It does not imply hierarchy. It does not imply destiny. This distinction is subtle, but important. Acknowledging variation without assigning value to it allows for a more accurate understanding of humanity. It permits curiosity without judgment. It replaces simplistic categories with context. When people ask why human skin is different across the world, they are often searching for a deeper explanation of human difference more broadly. The biological answer is almost disappointingly simple. Skin responded to sunlight. Everything else was layered on later. That simplicity can be unsettling because it removes familiar narratives. It leaves little room for ideas about inherent superiority, natural order, or predetermined roles. Biology offers no support for those concepts. It describes processes, not meanings. At the same time, this simplicity can be grounding. It reveals how close humans are to one another beneath the surface. It shows that the traits used most often to divide people are among the least significant biologically. It reframes difference as a byproduct of adaptation rather than a marker of identity. This reframing matters in the modern world, where people of all skin tones live under the same skies, share the same technologies and face the same global challenges. Climate change, pandemics, resource distribution and social stability do not recognize pigmentation. They affect bodies according to exposure, vulnerability and circumstance, not colour. Biology reinforces this reality. the systems that determine health outcomes, resilience, and behaviour are deeply shared. Where disparities exist, they arise overwhelmingly from social conditions rather than genetic ones. Recognising this does not erase the impact of history. Social meanings attached to skin colour have shaped lives, institutions, and opportunities. Those consequences are real and ongoing, but biology can clarify what those meanings are not. They are not natural outcomes of evolution. They are not encoded in DNA. They are not inevitable. The shared story written on human skin is therefore both ancient and unfinished. Ancient because it reflects tens of thousands of years of adaptation to light and place. Unfinished because humans continue to move, mix, and reshape their environments faster than biology can respond. In the future, skin colour may become even less tied to geography. Global migration and intermarriage will continue to blend traits. Cultural practices will continue to buffer environmental pressures. Selection on pigmentation will remain weak. Variation will persist, but its patterns may blur. Or perhaps new pressures will arise. Changes in climate could alter UV exposure patterns. Shifts in lifestyle could modify vitamin D availability. Evolution will respond only if those pressures affect survival and reproduction consistently over many generations. There is no guarantee of direction, only response. What will not change is the underlying unity of the species. The same skin, built from the same layers, performing the same functions, responding to the same physics of light, will continue to cover human bodies everywhere. When you look at your own skin, whatever shade it happens to be, you are looking at a small piece of that shared history. You're seeing sunlight recorded indirectly, movement traced faintly, time compressed into pigment. It is not a message about who you are meant to be. It is a record of where your ancestors lived long enough for their bodies to adjust. That record is neither a burden nor a badge. It is simply information. And when you look at someone else's skin, different from yours in tone or texture, you're not seeing a boundary. You're seeing a variation on the same theme, shaped by a different set of conditions, carried forward into the same present moment. One species, many shades. A shared story, still unfolding, not toward an ending, but onward, shaped by light, culture, movement, and the quiet continuity of being human.